Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody here today for what should be a terrific panel. Won't spare you long introductions, but I'm Susan Glasser. I'm the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and I'm thrilled to be here today. This is going to be, I think, a really unique event, sort of threat assessment of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the bigger picture regional issues with some of the very best people around. I think we'll hear a lot of different viewpoints and also make sure to get to yours questions as well today. The timing couldn't be better to have both a real sense of what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also how that plugs into what is going to be, I think, the next few months of very intensive Washington focus on what the situation in the region really is. So it couldn't be better timing. I also should say that I'm very grateful on behalf of Foreign Policy to once again be doing this with our partners here at New America. This is also our effort to mark the 1-year anniversary of an experiment that we've been conducting on foreignpolicy.com. It's a joint project called the AfPak Channel, and if you haven't seen it already, I do hope you'll check it out, including signing up for our daily brief, which Catherine and Andrew, who's here somewhere, do every day, and really has become sort of a go-to daily source for news and information that you won't see in other places about what's happening in the region. So we're 1 year into this experiment, and I can't think of a better way to market than with having such a really insightful and distinguished group of people to give us their threat assessment of what is happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan today. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers in the order we're going to go. Michael Waltz in the middle here is just back from spending time on the ground as a commander of a U.S. Army Special Forces Reserve unit, and has served several previous tours in Afghanistan as well. But he's uniquely positioned, I think, to marry that sort of ground truth, if you will, and his own experience there with the Washington story, because he has a long history and narrative of that part of the war too. He was a former advisor to former Vice President Cheney on South Asia and Counterterrorism, and he also served as a country director for Afghanistan in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as well as serving in the Pentagon's Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Forces and Low-Intensity Conflict. So we're certainly looking forward to hearing your insights and experiences, not only your most recent tour in Afghanistan, but also how they connect back to what's happening here in Washington. Then we'll go to Shuja Nawaz, who I think most of you here know him as the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. He's also the author of Crossed Swords, Pakistan, Its Army, and the Wars Within, and has also produced a book on Fatah called, perhaps very appropriately, A Most Dangerous Place. He has been an advisor to the Minister of Planning and Development for the government of Pakistan, and was formerly the director of a large division of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And finally, Peter Bergen, who is the co-director of New America's Counterterrorism Strategy Initiative. He's a commentator who you all know on CNN. He's the author of Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden, the Osama bin Laden I Know, and forthcoming even more wonderful work on this subject. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to have all of them. They'll be doing quick presentations, and then we'll have a conversation and bring everybody into it. When we do get to questions, if you could just identify yourself and your organization, that would be great. Thank you so much. And Michael, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Peter, for having me today. This is the first event that I've agreed to do since coming back from Afghanistan. I've discussed doing events like this with other folks, and have just declined for various reasons. But I have to tell you, just up front, I was recently kind of so disturbed by some of the reports coming out, particularly the Afghan Study Group, that and kind of where that's taking the discourse in Washington. And since I've been back in Washington, compared with what I saw in Afghanistan, that I readily agreed when Peter called, and thank you again. I think I'm going to structure my remarks in kind of those two veins. I've worn a policy hat in a number of offices in the Pentagon and in the White House, as Susan mentioned, and coupled with in between multiple tours out to Afghanistan from Helmand and Nimruz in the southwest up to Nangarhar in the northeast, and in this last tour had responsibility for operations in Khost, Paktika, and Ghazni. So I'm going to talk some kind of from a national security perspective, but then also some lessons learned and some observations out in the field, particularly this last year. From a national security perspective, I think the president did say, and I readily agreed on his campaign trail, that this is the effort in Afghanistan and in Pakistan is a war of necessity. It's not an optional effort. It is something that it's an effort in which we must prevail. And I personally, speaking, am absolutely convinced that should the Taliban, the Haqqani network, the HIG, and the syndicate that the insurgency is comprised of now, take control of portions of Afghanistan, either through negotiations or through military victory or what have you, I am convinced, and with both of those experiences, that al-Qaeda will reconstitute. Al-Qaeda will be able to plan and plot and train and strike the United States again. So in my view, and again, just kind of stating views right up front and where I'm coming from, I am convinced that failure in Afghanistan, failure as defined by international terrorists being able to strike the homeland and being able to reconstitute, I'm convinced that failure there will follow us here to mainland USA. So in that vein, and taking that assumption on the face of it, I did agree with, as the current administration went through its strategic review process, I participated in President Bush's review process in late 2008, where the president made a conscious decision, President Bush, to not publicize those findings and kind of slide them across the table to the transition team for them to build and build upon and take on as their own. I did agree and do support the current administration narrowing our strategic goals to essentially defeating al-Qaeda and creating an Afghanistan that prevents their return. I also agree that it's completely appropriate to take on a broad-based, holistic, whole-of-government counterinsurgency strategy. Where I have some concern and have some issue is that we've accepted an inherently and an historically long-term strategy and embarked on it, but we've imposed short-term timelines. And just as a side anecdote, kind of transitioning to the operational side, I was standing in my headquarters watching the speech at West Point. We were preparing to embark up into the mountains of Khost to meet with a series of elders and tribes that we had been working with and building rapport and establishing for some time. Standing in my talk, I have to tell you, in my Tactical Operations Center, I was mortified at the July 11 announcement. Within a week, just kind of fast forwarding, elders and the Afghans in a society with very little media, with a very high illiteracy rate, had heard of the date, kind of missed the nuance of conditions-based and everything that went on with it. And essentially, over that next week, as I held shura after shura, they said, look, we suspected always kind of deep down that you were going to leave us again, and now we know. You said it. Your leader said it. Why should I work with you? Why am I risking my life by even talking to you today? It had some very real consequences out on the ground in a very short timeline, and I just wanted to share that with you. And that was on the Afghan side and on the Pakistani side as we met with border tribal areas. Many of the tribes there, as you all well know, transcend both sides of the border. So I just reject the notion out of hand that imposing deadlines causes kind of greater urgency or better behavior. As another interesting kind of sub-bullet, we actually saw in our areas corruption increase after December and January, because it was very much a mentality of kind of amongst government officials, amongst contractors, of kind of get it while you can, because the well is soon to dry up, and we saw corruption spike in our areas. So that's the short-term timeline on a long-term strategy, and particularly in South Asia, given our history there, I see as very problematic. The other is resources. So we've adopted, again, rightly, a strategy that historically takes a very long time and immense resources, but we still haven't, in my view, resourced it properly. A country larger than Iraq physically, with a larger population, about 31, 32 million compared to Iraq's about 25 million, so a substantial difference. The population is more dispersed. It's not as concentrated in urban centers. It's landlocked. I can go on and on. It's largely illiterate, no immediate means to natural resources, little infrastructure, depleted human capital, devastated infrastructure, and on and on. But at the end of our surge, which is happening about now, by the end of the year, we'll only have 2/3 the numbers that we had in Iraq, given those difficulties. And in my view, that's just simply not going to be enough. And what we've done, there's a notion that as we've introduced our forces into area, it's a contagion that's caused the security situation to get worse. I have a very different view looking at this same set of facts. We've, over the years, as the security situation has worsened due to our absence, we've kind of chased it with resources, and it gets worse, and we put in more resources. And we've taken a very incremental approach rather than getting ahead of it to tamp down violence and insecurity so that other things like governance and development can improve. So that's kind of where I am in terms of long-term strategy, short-term timeline, not enough resources. In my view, we need to be doing more in Afghanistan and over a longer term rather than the arguments now for less. I just don't buy the notion that it's hard and therefore we need to rethink our strategy. In that view, or in that vein, I do have to say, and I am confident of speaking on this with authority, I think the notion of this kind of an offshore counterterrorism strategy is frankly a fallacy, and only very marginally effective. And I'm going to be very blunt here, so forgive me, but I think suggesting that type of strategy in that part of the world is dangerously naive. And I think it's been made by those who, frankly, have never had to actually execute a CT strategy on the ground. And sometimes I wonder, it's almost this Tom Clancy-like notion of what we can really do. And I think it's one of the reasons why our nation's foremost CT expert, who did execute a very effective find, fix, and finish strategy, Stan McChrystal, when put in charge in Afghanistan, advocated a coin strategy, not a CT strategy. So I think we have to be very careful there. I think another word of caution is this kind of ebb and flow, and I see them used interchangeably, of what constitutes al-Qaeda in Afghanistan then versus foreign fighters. I can tell you on direct authority that P2KG, Paktia, Paktika, Khost, and Ghazni is replete with Uzbeks, Chechens, foreign fighters of all kinds. And whether our analysts and who's counting the numbers are calling them al-Qaeda, I'm not sure. But I think just a word of caution that we have to be very careful as we head into the debate this fall and into next year, who we're calling what and how we're counting these things. Because the foreign fighters are there and they're acting almost in an embedded trainer kind of model and mode with the Taliban. Just a few other things that kind of, again, from a strategic perspective that give me pause, and then I'll go to some operational issues. I also am concerned about the notion that we've been in Afghanistan for 9 years, and we've been on this course for 9 years, and it hasn't worked, so therefore we need to change. We've embarked on a counterinsurgency strategy for about 1 year, and for a variety of reasons. But I think we need to be very wide-eyed on how long we've actually adopted this strategy. As I've said earlier, I still don't think we've resourced it appropriately. And then we've undercut it with good intention, but I think a wrong approach with a short-term announced timeline. So we haven't been necessarily embarking on this effort for 9 years. Another concern is ethnic tension that I saw and witnessed, whether it was in the Army, in the police, and throughout our area. And I think Washington, to a large degree, is underestimating, and I just haven't seen it in the forefront of the discourse here. And it's really stemming from, again, some of these policy choices that we made, whether it was announcing July 11, Karzai's meetings with Kayani and Pasha, talk of transition, the Canadians and Dutch talking about leaving, talk of reconciliation, the firing of Saleh and Atmar, greater violence in the north. I can tell you that both my contacts back here as a civilian and out there, the Hazaras and the Tajiks are petrified, and they are reacting, and they're reaching out regionally, which has all kinds of bad connotations and consequences. So that leads me to my other concern is kind of reintegration and reconciliation. Out there talking to folks on the ground, the notion of reconciliation was almost frankly laughable. And I say that, we can get in a separate conversation about metric, but my metric was the Taliban and the Haqqanis believed they were winning, and the people believed they were winning, and I think it was dangerous, again, from an ethnic standpoint, to be talking reconciliation publicly. On the reintegration side, I think there are some great opportunities, but I think the sequencing is very important on how we do that, and we can have some very dangerous consequences if we get that out of sync. Okay, putting on my operational hat. I thought I would divide this very quickly into things I saw that were improving since I was last there operationally in 2006, and then before that in 2003, and then others that I think we still need to work on. I saw some real disconnects between the rhetoric of and the theory of counterinsurgency and then what we saw out on the ground. For instance, obviously we chose a population control strategy. We could have chosen a number of strategies, a deny enemy sanctuary strategy, a border control strategy. Frankly, I think one of our problems over those 9 years is that we've changed depending on the commander at the time. We've had a real lack of continuity in terms of our strategic approach. But we have publicly decided as a military and as a nation and in our civilian efforts a population control strategy. I have to tell you, though, by the time I left, this was 9 months later, in my major urban centers in Host, Gardez City, and in Ghazni City. In Host, there was about equivalent of a squad. In Ghazni City, there was even less. And Ghazni City, frankly, there was none. And in Gardez, there was not much. So I just wasn't seeing that kind of alignment of resources to fit the strategy. Just data point. The other piece was, again, good intentioned effort in introducing armored vehicles and the counter-IED piece, the V-shaped holes that are saving lives. The problem was they were doing such a good job that many commanders out there were making them mandatory. So quick anecdote. There was a platoon on the border in one of the provinces that had 5 of these vehicles. 2 or 3 were always broken. They just had real maintenance issues. But the rule was you had to have 4 operational to leave the wire. Well, if 2 or 3 were always broken, that kind of took that out of play. Okay, that's fine. We were working with these guys. They had a police station down the hill that they were mentoring. They had a huge kind of cross-border commercial area, bazaar, also down this hill. Hey, fine, guys, and why aren't you walking down there? Well, sir, I only have 23 guys here. Okay, so why aren't you walking down there? Well, it's minimum of 16 men to leave the wire. Okay, so why aren't you walking down there? Well, it's also a minimum of 12 men to guard the wire if we leave the wire. So do the math. The only time they left the wire is if reinforcements were flown in so that they could even go out on a patrol. And you can imagine then interacting with the populace became a periodic event rather than a daily, if not all the time, occurrence. So even in their police mentor role, so well, how do you mentor the police then and kind of know what they're up to? Are they credible actors? Are they acting professionally? So, well, we invite them periodically to meetings up here since we can't go really down there and live with them. So again, a very kind of soda straw view, but this accrual of rules over the 8 or 9 years now is almost having it is having just a very nonsensical effect on what the guys are doing versus what the commander's intent was. I'm kind of in a broader sense writing an op-ed now, or have it written on how the MRAP, in my view, will cause more casualties over the long run than it will save in the short run, because there's only so many roads that a 20-ton vehicle can go in Afghanistan. It's very easy to predict, very easy to know what we're doing. There are whole swaths of Afghanistan that we are no longer accessing. Another quick anecdote. The Mangal tribe, if those of you who are familiar with eastern Afghanistan, is a huge, historic tribe that several kings have come from and what have you. As special operations forces, we were exempt from those rules and could get up into the mountains to access these tribes and elders. They hadn't been really visited in 2 years. So their kind of above board motion, or their kind of first line was, how are you protecting us if you never come see us? How are we protecting a populace we're not accessing? And they desperately wanted to work with us, had historically worked with the Afghan government, but we were a very small force there because we could only get to them periodically, and we weren't in a position to live with them. Eventually they succumbed to the Haqqanis, cut a deal, gave them part of their land for training camps and for bases activity, and this is pretty deep into Afghanistan. One of the contrasts I saw was that in 05, 06, the Haqqanis and the Taliban in their south were kind of cross-border and back. This time, they had established internal sanctuary and were moving into the provinces just south of coast. And in my view, one of the reasons was that we weren't able to effectively interact with these tribes, much of which was because of our own force protection measures. Civilian casualties, I think, rightly needed to be adjusted and addressed and dealt with. I would argue, though, that the pendulum went too far. Bottom line, if I have areas that are being rocketed and attacked and we're not responding because of concerns, oftentimes they would purposely launch from within or near houses, and even though my guys could see that they were abandoned, there was just hand-wringing and what have you, inaction has a propaganda value as well. And our inaction was allowing local commanders to say the Americans are feckless, they've said they're leaving, they don't have the will, you better decide, elder, tribal, villageman, Pashtun, whomever, government official, who you work with. So just, again, another data point that inaction had some very real consequences. Finally, I would just say that on the kind of improved security is the oxygen that development and governance needs to breathe. A mock bill elder, different elder. Bottom line, we had poured a ton of CERT money, a ton of USAID working with the local PRT into this area and into this tribe, and we were just still having some very real security concerns. We lost several policemen and ANA in their area within a week, and finally sat the elders down. And it's interesting when you build a relationship with the Afghans. I think for about the first, so many months, they kind of have their party line or talking points that they say to us. And if you develop enough of a relationship, you really get down to the gist of things. And so they have what they say to the Americans, and they have what they say to each other. And we finally got to what they say to each other. And he said, look, you can build all the roads, all the schools, all the wells that you want, and we need it, and we truly and deeply appreciate it. But at the end of the day, if the Haqqanis have a knife to my family's throat because at night you leave, what do you expect me to do? And I frankly didn't have a great answer for that. So again, back to the resources piece and being able to truly protect the populace, to let those other things develop. Okay, I don't want to paint too negative of a picture, and I don't want to go too long. Some positives, an organization called Task Force 2010 to really get their finger on the pulse of where our contracting dollars are going and how they become a counterinsurgency tool versus kind of the bean counters of the world, just ensuring we're sticking to contracting policy versus being able to use it as a reward, as a tool, to isolate and influence, I think is a huge step forward. The program which I implemented 2 of in my area, it's evolved, but now called the Afghan Local Police. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about the program, but in my provinces, these were what they call Arbakai, tribal protection forces that already existed, were already armed, and we embedded with them and worked with them to work with us. And it was almost always in cases where the tribe had reached out to us for support. And I think if you couple that with a population control strategy in the major cities and roads, and then use these other local security initiatives as an economy of force effort, it can augment what we're doing with the Army and the police and not compete with it. And then I guess the last positive was that al-Qaeda, from what we saw, truly was on its back foot. But again, that's because we were there to build that network to compete with another network. I believe this is a winnable war, and it's a must-win. Success, again, is defined by al-Qaeda defeated, and the insurgency becoming, for the Afghans, more of a policing effort than a military effort, and working the situation so that the government is in a position of strength versus how it's currently viewed as reaching out from a position of weakness, is defining success. And again, the bottom line is, in my view, the people want us there. I just reject this xenophobic notion of the Afghans viewing every Westerner as a contagion. It's just, I know there are prominent folks who have that view. It's just not my experience at all. The most angry Afghans that I ever came across were those that we dealt with, that we interacted with. They risked their lives to interact with us, and then we left that night. That's what made them angry, not that we were there. Most inherently know that we want to take Afghanistan to a better place, but they're survivalists at heart. They're going to back a winner. And right now, in my view, we have to show that we have the will and the long-term ability to stay. And if the winning hand is siding with us rather than hedging against us, and that the winning hand is siding with us rather than hedging against us, and that's in Afghanistan and in the region. And I'll stop with that.
Michael, thank you so much, Michael. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you after that very forthright statement. Shuja, we're looking forward to your Pakistan presentation.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to Peter and his whole team. The last year has been an active one for us on the Afghan-Pakistan channel. And I think the amount of information and knowledge that we've created, because all information not necessarily contributes to knowledge, I think has been quite tremendous, and you should all be very proud of it.
That's very good, Shuja.
I'm going to look at it from the Pakistani perspective, and this is really a continuation of an earlier paper and an idea of the Battle for Pakistan, which a piece that I did some time ago for, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. And it's such an interesting title. I think my friend Aisha Jalal has now got a book underway, which is ready to come out with the same title. So I'm glad that we're all thinking along the same lines. And I'm going to look at it from 2 perspectives. One is the external one, focusing primarily on Afghanistan and the Afghanistan-Pakistan nexus. And then the other is the internal one, and looking at the weaknesses of the state, particularly after the floods, and looking to see if there's a turning point in the battle against the Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan and al-Qaeda, and what to make of the Punjabi militants. On the external side, let me begin by saying that I entirely agree with Mike on the issue of the date that was delivered in those 10 words in that short sentence in the President's speech at West Point at the outset of his speech. And since then, everybody in the region, and now we hear from Mike and we've heard from others, everyone in Afghanistan in particular, only heard those 10 words. And the point that we've been trying to make to US policymakers at all levels is that nobody reads the footnotes. That you can be hoarse in explaining what we really meant was, and this is a transition, it's the beginning of the beginning, or the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. And most recently, we're looking at the Secretary General NATO talking about 2014, which is a Karzai deadline for having enough forces. The question in the end will come down to who defines this end game. And if the target is to create such a vast Afghan military force to fight the insurgency, when it will be primarily a policing effort that will isolate the militants and give people security in the cities, and you can build from that a greater sense of security in Afghanistan, who on earth is going to be able to support this larger force? Is the coalition going to be committed to providing an endless stream of resources? So these are all some of the issues that are behind what is now being called the end game in Afghanistan, and what is being seen particularly in the region and particularly across the border in Pakistan. So the Pakistan calculus has for quite some time, and it was reinforced by the West Point speech, been that it would help to continue hedging and to help to continue hedging in favor of Pashtun groups, and very specifically the one Pashtun group with which there has been a long-term relationship out of North Waziristan, which is the Haqqani group. And I'm glad that Mike is here, because the territory that he is describing, Khost and Paktia and the Logar province, this is the territory that the Haqqani group uses in order to launch its attacks on Kabul. Now, there may be some debate about how effective Haqqani was, and the fact that he may or may not have been successful in disrupting the Kabul peace conference. But the point is, he is still there, and if Mike's information from the ground is correct, then he has sanctuary inside Afghanistan as well. And so even if you were to try and seal the border, which is an impossible task, you would still not be able to solve the Haqqani problem, which would then further reinforce the Pakistani calculation that perhaps this is a good thing. Now the question is that really such a good thing for Pakistan to be seen so overtly as being in favor of this one group? Because can Haqqani essentially deliver all of Afghanistan? In my view, perhaps not, because it will end up with creating a division inside Afghanistan. And it would end up creating a division which would not redound to Pakistan's favor, because you may end up with the northern part of Afghanistan, which would become an even more implacable foe of Pakistan. And if we are going to try from Pakistan to make up for the mistakes of the Soviet war, when we did not favor the Panjshiris, that we favored people like Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, and look where that led us, then it will further consolidate their view that Pakistan is against the other ethnic groups inside Afghanistan, and that they only want to favor the Pashtuns, and specifically Haqqani within the Pashtun galaxy. The other thing, of course, is that there's a very strong possibility that Pakistan may be overestimating its ability to control Haqqani. That supposing Haqqani does succeed and becomes a major player in Afghanistan, will he then follow what Pakistan wants him to do? The track record has historically not been very much in Pakistan's favor. Obviously, from the time when they supported the Taliban and the Taliban took over Kabul, by all accounts, and having spoken to almost all the ambassadors from Pakistan that represented the country with the Taliban government, Mullah Omar never once listened to what they said. So the record doesn't increase the probability that Pakistan will have much greater leverage. There are some other factors that one needs to take into account on Afghanistan. First of all, the fact that the people of Pakistan at large have shown a complete distaste for the Taliban style of rule. And I refer to the operations in Swat and Malakand, which won such public support for the army and the civilian government to actually come together and to go after the Taliban-style rule, because this is not what the people of Pakistan believe in. And I think that has not changed. That gave the army the impetus to move heavily into South Waziristan also. But if that's the case, why would they want to favor having a Taliban government sitting in Kabul? Because the danger of a contagion effect coming back across the border would then be increased tremendously. The other is a domestic effect inside inside North Waziristan in particular. It is quite clear that when the Pakistan Army moved in force into South Waziristan, a lot of the TTP escapees moved north, but a number of them moved into North Waziristan and were given shelter either by Haqqani or by the fringe elements around the Haqqani coalition in North Waziristan. And over time, there have been reports that these people have been involved in attacks on the Pakistan Army, and that the Pakistan Army now does have indeed a very large force in North Waziristan, the largest in any of the agencies of Fatah, something like 35,000 people. And they are basically sitting there and are subject to attacks, and the colonels of the regiments that are being attacked and that are losing the odd man here and there don't take that very kindly. So that kind of resentment is going to bubble up through the ranks and reach the Pakistan High Command. And this will certainly affect troop morale. And another thing that will certainly affect troop morale is the fact that after the floods, with the damage to the infrastructure and the fact that a lot of the Pakistan military forces in the hinterland that were being used to rotate troops in and out of Fatah are now going to be extended up to 18 months inside Fatah. That's certainly not going to help troop morale in the long run. So we have to keep that in mind when we look at what Pakistan is doing in Fatah in relation to its aims in Afghanistan. Now, what's likely? I think if the coalition manages to put enough pressure on Haqqani in Khost, in Paktia, in the contiguous or the nearby provinces that abut Fatah, then I think there may be an opportunity for Pakistan also to move against him, because he'll be in a weak spot and he's not likely to be seen as a winner. But if they fail, and if what Mike is saying is correct, that there are sanctuaries and that people are now picking sides and Haqqani seems to be on the winning side in those provinces, then it becomes a dangerous situation for Pakistan as well. And the fact that if they take him on, he may then use his Afghan sanctuaries to attack them. And so the situation will be reversed. Now, there is one ray of hope, and my friend Arno de Bergrav is staring at me because he accuses me of being an optimist and always reminds me that a pessimist is an optimist with experience. So I quoted you correctly, Arno. There is some hope, and that is that in the higher command of the Pakistan military, specifically in General Kiani, there is now a different view of Afghanistan. Last year, when he came to the NDU in Washington, he articulated what he called his vision of strategic depth. Now, this is a phrase that was introduced into the lexicon of the subcontinent and Afghanistan and Pakistan by two famous generals, the General Aslam Beg and his sidekick, General Hamid Gul. And their idea was that Pakistan needed physical strategic depth in Afghanistan and Iran, so that if ever India were to invade and occupy large tracts of Pakistan, that this would give them an opportunity to escape and regroup and fight. This approach really passed when they moved from power, but the phrase continues to linger even in policy circles and among analysts in Washington, unfortunately. So it was interesting that General Kiani actually used that phrase to redefine it as being a stable and a friendly Afghanistan, rather than an Afghanistan that Pakistan saw as simply giving it some physical depth. So Pakistan's preference is to have this friendly border, to have a friendly state in Afghanistan, and to avoid having two hot borders. Of course, there is also a tremendous opportunity for U.S. policy in the region to use, for the first time in history, its strategic relationship with India and with Pakistan to try and end the hostility between these two countries and to perhaps bring some sense of normalcy to that relationship. And if we are optimistic, perhaps even open up trade and other communications. If that happens, then Pakistan will have two cool borders rather than two very hot borders. And that will change its calculus and will change its focus from the external threat to the internal threat. So let's move on to the internal threat. Quite clearly, after public support and outcry against the Taliban, the Pakistan military has managed to successfully dislocate, and I use my words very carefully, dislocate the Tehreek-e-Taliban, roust them from South Waziristan, which is their tribal base, so that they're now seeking shelter elsewhere and don't have the same strength. It has certainly destroyed the coalition of the TTP that had emerged across Fatah and across what used to be the Northwest Frontier Province and now is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, so that coalition is broken. However, it has not destroyed the leadership. Neither has it yet effectively changed the underlying conditions that led to the creation of the Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan. And it has produced a new threat, which is a rise in suicide bombings inside the hinterland against soft targets. And I predict that there's going to be an increase in these kinds of attacks every time the military makes moves in Fatah. There's also a danger of an increase in the activities of the Punjabi militants. There are already visible signs of alliances that have been formed between the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed with elements in Fatah. The LET has also been among those foreign fighters that have been operating inside Afghanistan, according to some reports recently. And most certainly, the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi has entered the ethnic battleground in not just Parachinar and Kurram, but also in Quetta. And I was there in April, and literally the day after I was wandering on Jinnah Road, there was a huge attack, a suicide bombing attack on a hospital after they tried to kill a person, and 43 people were killed. So these kinds of attacks will continue. They're not winning friends for these groups inside Pakistan, but they certainly show the potency of their ability to hurt the state and the state apparatus. Now, the floods have exacerbated the situation. The economy is very seriously threatened. Growth rates, which were previously seen at 3 to 4%, are now being talked about officially at 2%. More realistically, perhaps, will end up at 0 or even minus. If that's the case, then there's going to be the danger of very steep slide in the security situation too, particularly if the lack of governance persists. The longer-term effects of the floods are going to be there, and they haven't yet fully shown up. The very first assessments that will be completed will be October 15th by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, when we'll put some kind of a number on the losses. The government is already talking of $43 billion. I mean, just to give you one factoid on this, the largest single element in Pakistan's agricultural production, according to the FAO, is buffalo milk. And that accounts for something like $10 billion a year, which is the largest single element in agricultural production. So if the floods have destroyed all this livestock in the heartland, people that were surviving on buffalo milk are not going to be able to do so. So how do we replace that livestock? There was never a proper census, so any numbers that you use are really not going to be very useful. But the reality is that the people have lost livestock, they've lost their equipment, they've lost their homes, they've lost the seed stock, they have lost the infrastructure, the bridges and the roads that allowed them to grow things and move them to market. And they've lost this planting season that starts in October, and who knows, they may have lost the next planting season for next year. In which case, for the first time in Pakistan, we're going to see a huge divide between the cities and the rural population. And if the rural population becomes unhappy with the political status quo, they're going to be ripe for revolt and rebellion and protests, and this is going to completely shake up the political system. That's something that the government needs to be very aware of. The gap between the civil and the military is widening too, and the floods seem to have exacerbated that situation too, because suddenly the military moved and the government took its time. And it's now catching up, but they missed an opportunity. They had a national disaster response plan this spring, but it was never implemented up and down the ladder and never coordinated with the provinces. And it was clear to the people that when the aid arrives, it's only the military or the U.S. that is providing that aid. It's the U.S. helicopters that they're seeing. It's the Pakistan military that they're seeing. One anecdote from the Nowshera, Charsada, Mardan area, when U.S. reporters arrived on the scene, they were told by the local people that the provincial government had told them that the floods will come and then the waters will go down south and you'll be okay. But if you have any problems, just call us. Well, the floods came and the waters continued to rise. They started calling the provincial government and they took the phones off the hook. It was only at the evening when the flood waters had reached the second and third floors of some of the homes that the army arrived and helped them get out of harm's way. So this gap between how the public perceives the military and the civil is certainly not going to help the polity of Pakistan, which is already fractured. What's also not going to help is the greater activism of the Supreme Court. And as the Supreme Court gets into internal issues like the cases of the disappeared, which are related to rendition to US and to Bagram and other places, that is also going to be a cause of conflict inside the political system. So, in brief, and to sum up, I would say that the battle for Pakistan has now reached a very dangerous phase. This is going to be a testing time for the fledgling democracy of Pakistan, but also an opportunity for it to show that it can reflect the people's needs and that it can work to establish its supremacy over the military, a supremacy that the United States and other allies of Pakistan certainly want to support. But the question is, will Pakistan politics turn from family business to representing the people's wishes? And that is the question that only the Pakistanis can answer. Thank you.
Shuja, thank you so much. That was really terrific. Peter is going to give us more of a sense of where al-Qaeda still fits into this emerging picture.
Well, I wanted to thank Mike and Shuja for those incredibly lucid and useful presentations. And before I discuss al-Qaeda, I just wanted to make some observations that kind of jump out from those discussions. For the people who say we should do less in Afghanistan, they have to answer a very simple question. Since we've already tried to do less in Afghanistan twice as a country, why would it work better the next time? So in 1989, after the most successful covert operation in US history to defeat the Soviets, we closed our embassy and then we zeroed out aid to one of the poorest countries in the world. Into that vacuum stepped the Taliban and then al-Qaeda. And then we did it all over again in 2001 because of an ideological opposition to nation building by the Bush administration. We did it on the cheap, and you get what you pay for. The size of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan in 2003 was 6,000 men. In a country the size of Texas, that's the size of the Houston Police Department. It's not really going to work. So we've already done this. And so why would it be better the next time is really the question. Complicating the issue, of course, is that we really have three wars going on in Afghanistan right now. We have an intra-Pashtun war between people who are getting the proceeds of all these corrupt contracts, the Duranis, broadly speaking, and the rural Pashtuns who have always been on the outs, maybe the Gilzais, to use a kind of cartoonish. Then you have the inter-ethnic war, which Mike mentioned, which has sort of been going on in different shapes or form. And then, of course, you have the regional war to which Shuja has addressed. So that's what makes this problem so complex. I completely agree with Mike and Shuja that July 2011 drawdown date was too clever by half. we all know what it was intended to signal. It was intended to signal to the American audience that we're not going to be there forever. It was intended to tell the Afghans, get your act together. Well, the way they did that was, we're going to take all our money to Dubai as quickly as possible. So it didn't, and then, of course, regionally, it signaled we were leaving for the exits. And I was in Helmand about a year ago, and talking to tribal elders, the Marines were very clear, we're not here forever. They were being honest. Well, unfortunately, when you say that to the tribal elder and then you say who you going to support, they say, well, look, Taliban's strong, you're strong, we'll just sort of wait and see, which is basically the Afghan approach for a very long time, and you can hardly blame them. I want to endorse Shuja's point. Arno de Borschgrave, sitting here in the audience, the only person probably in Washington who's ever met Mullah Omar and interviewed him at some length before 9/11. Mullah Omar did not take direction from the Pakistanis. I mean, on some very important issues, hand over bin Laden. Don't destroy the Buddhas of Bamiyan. So the idea that the Pakistanis are going to wave a magic wand over all these groups and it's all going to be sort of, they're all going to be singing Kumbaya, I think is naive. I also wanted to very much endorse Shuja's point about the enormous change that's happened in Pakistan, something that I keep hearing American policymakers and people who should know better not really understanding this yet, or the shift in Pakistan has been so dramatic. If you were to construct an information operation campaign against the Taliban, you couldn't come up with anything better than sending every Pakistani parent saying, do not send your kids to school. We're concerned the Pakistani Taliban is going to attack your kids, which is what happened about a year ago. If you were to construct a campaign, the most self-defeating thing the Taliban could do would be attacking the Pakistani equivalent of the Pentagon, which they did over a 20-hour period. They attacked GHQ in Rawalpindi. One way to get the attention of the Pakistani military is to attack their headquarters at great length and kill people inside it. So there's a dramatic change in the way the Taliban is viewed. If you look at the polling data on the al-Qaeda or bin Laden support for the suicide bombing, it's all cratering in Pakistan because the Taliban are doing what al-Qaeda-like groups always do, essentially kill a lot of Muslim civilians when push comes to shove. So their religious Robin Hood image, which they used to have, has basically just been decimated. I was in Pakistan when Bayatollah Masood was killed. The lead headline in Dawn, the quality newspaper, was "Killer Bayatollah, good riddance," in sort of huge capital letters. So there's been a shift. Finally, on Kiani, I think Kiani is thinking strategically, and I also wanted to endorse what Shuja said. I think there is a change, a shift. I mean, when you have nuclear weapons, the strategic depth doesn't make any difference. You're not going to retreat into your own nuclear wasteland that's behind you. It shifts the kind of strategic narrative. On the U.S. role, I think there were all sorts of good reasons. The Indians put a lot of pressure and make sure that Holbrooke didn't have India as part of its responsibility. But at the end of the day, none of this is going to be really going to work unless we can reassure the Pakistanis that they don't have a massive Indian aircraft carrier called Afghanistan. Right now that's their belief. They see the Indian consulates, as you know, as sort of a fifth column. They see the fact that India is one of the largest contributors of aid to Afghanistan as a problem, and we have to reassure them. And at the end of the day, perhaps a neutral Afghanistan that the United Nations endorses, and there are some sanctions there. Something that Rick Inderfer has suggested is one approach, and obviously solving Kashmir, not an easy thing, is the other. So those were just some observations on what Shuja and Mike had to say. I'm going to very briefly try and sort of talk about the al-Qaeda threat. I think the al-Qaeda threat is very, very much lower than it was on 9/11. We're talking about dozens of people, hundreds if they ever got lucky. If they blew up 253 over Detroit, it would have been hundreds of people. If you look at the WMD kind of capabilities of al-Qaeda, they've been extremely minimal. Syracuse University, the Maxwell School, and the New America Foundation surveyed 172 jihadi terrorist cases in this country since 9/11, and none of them involved WMD of any form, chemical, weapons, bio, nuke, radiological. So I think that speaks for itself. There obviously has been a change in recent years in sort of the kinds of domestic radicalization we're seeing. One thing is really interesting is the Americanization of the leaders of these groups. So, for instance, Omar Hamami, who is one of the leaders of al-Shabaab, is a Baptist convert from Alabama to Islam, and now he's one of the operational commanders of al-Shabaab and a very important propagandist. Anwar al-Awlaki hardly needs much more elaboration, playing an important operational role in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And Shukr Juma, who is now seems to be the leader of al-Qaeda's external operations, who tasked Najibullah al-Azazi to attack the Manhattan subway. He's a guy who grew up in Brooklyn, grew up in Florida. And then you have David Headley, who played an absolutely critical role in scoping out all the targets in Mumbai, a guy from Chicago. So this is different. Also, we've had a record number of cases last year, by our count, 43 cases of Americans or American residents being convicted or charged of jihadi terrorist crimes, and this year already 20. We're also seeing Americans exporting the jihad overseas. We used to worry about Sunni militants coming into this country. Now you've got David Headley going to Chicago as a sort of operational leader for Lashkar-e-Taiba, and also going to Denmark to scope out attacks on the Danish cartoonists who painted offensive cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. We're seeing a diversification of the types of people joining these groups. There's no ethnic profiles. Very interesting of the cases since 2008 where we can determine ethnicity. It's really very you're as likely to join if you're a Caucasian or if you're an Arab American. There are a disproportionately large number of Somali Americans. That's because there are a lot of Somali American cases right now. The kinds of targets we'll see in the future are basically the ones they've done before: commercial aviation, smaller scale attacks. Western brand name hotels, particularly in the Muslim world, we've seen a blizzard of those kinds of attacks, Jewish and Israeli targets. American suicide operations would be very naive to presume they won't be happening here. Once you have Americans conducting suicide operations overseas, it'll come here. We saw this with the British. The first British suicide attack was in Kashmir in 2000. The second was in Tel Aviv in 2003. The British government officially concluded that it was very unlikely they'd face domestic suicide attacks in Britain. It turned out to be very naive. 7/7 happened, 4 British suicide attackers. Attacks on U.S. military targets, particularly in this country, Major Nidal Hassan, the Fort Dix case, the case in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the guy shot up a military recruiting station. We'll likely see more of those. Attacks on people who've perceived to have insulted Islam. I mean, Terry Jones, the pastor in Florida, certainly took a big target off himself. But we've seen multiple attempts to kill the Swedish and Danish cartoonists. And this is like the Salman Rushdie affair for these groups. I mean, they're not going to forget this issue. No attacks, I think, in Anywheresville, USA, at least by al-Qaeda or affiliated groups. The attacks in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles, the people they're trying to influence don't care about Des Moines, haven't heard about Des Moines, or some small town in the Midwest. They care about New York. And if you look at the Najib al-Azazi, the Manhattan subway attacker, at least is the plan that he had. He traveled from Colorado to Manhattan to execute the attack. He was living in Colorado. He didn't attack in Denver where he was living. Some thoughts about some factors that are working for and against these groups. For these groups, al-Qaeda is ideologically infected the Pakistani Taliban. Faisal Shahzad speaks for himself. There was also a group of suicide bombers who were sent to Barcelona by the Pakistani Taliban in January 2008, which should have been an indicator that they were interested in attacking the West. The kind of joint operation on the CIA base in Host was a Pakistani Taliban al-Qaeda operation. Lashkar-e-Taiba now acting in an al-Qaeda-like manner, sending suicide attackers to Mumbai specifically to attack American Jewish targets. Al-Qaeda, obviously, its affiliates, they go up and down. Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb is pretty weak. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is back, which I think was highly predictable. Al-Shabaab has some ability to do out-of-area operations, which I think is disturbing. They sent an assassin to kill the Danish cartoonist unsuccessfully. Relatively recently, they also did the attack in Kampala that killed more than 70 people. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, obviously, again, out-of-area operations are possible with that. The leadership of al-Qaeda is still out there. I think that's important. Leaders are, bin Laden is the leader of the world jihad movement. So when he says, as he did in 2008, we're going to respond to the Danish cartoons, we had an attack on the Danish embassy in Islamabad that killed 6 and all the other things I've already mentioned. Our own overreactions plays into this as well. Near misses produces enormously hysterical reaction amongst the media and some politicians, and clearly terrorist groups understand that. On the other side of the ledger, drone attacks are somewhat interruptive of al-Qaeda. Catherine Tiedemann maintains our great drones database, which I think is the best open source information out there about the drone attacks. But a couple of caveats. Certainly, if you're worried about survival, you're not necessarily being able to plan operations. But I would caveat that with 3 things. First of all, Najib al-Azazi got training in the tribal regions after the drone program was ramped up. Faisal Shahzad got 5 days training. Now, maybe he was there for 40 days. Maybe if the drones weren't around, maybe he would have had a longer training program. Maybe he would have been more successful in Times Square. But Westerners and people living in the West are still going to the tribal regions, even with the drones. And the other, if the drones were really that successful, one of the indicators that you would expect would be rapidly declining violence in Pakistan and Afghanistan, because after all, so many of the groups that are here in the tribal regions are the genesis of these attacks, and also providing the suicide attacks. And yet we're seeing record amounts of violence in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'm not saying it's all coming out of the tribal regions, but clearly it hasn't reduced the violence on either side of the border. Al-Qaeda's propaganda operations took a big hit in 2008. They take their operations seriously. 2007 was a record year. They went down in 2008. They went back up in 2009. Both bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri haven't been saying very much recently, so perhaps they are more worried about survival than public relations. But drones are, not a magic bullet, but they are having some effect. Just to what Shuja said about the Pakistani government, military and public, and the changing views on military operations, I think is very true. And then just that story, of course, is happening writ large in the Muslim world, where if you look at support for suicide bombing, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, in every country around the Muslim world, it's tanking rather dramatically. Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, I think, is more or less out of business, for instance, the Al-Qaeda affiliate there. And then people on the right wing of the jihadi movement, or people that once bin Laden looked to for support or religious support or military support, have turned against him. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group has officially sort of turned against Al-Qaeda's ideology. Major religious clerics in Saudi Arabia like Salman al-Auda have publicly criticized not just terrorism or 9/11, but bin Laden by name, which is very interesting. Al-Qaeda's never responded to that. They never said anything about the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group very publicly renouncing their ideology, and they never responded to Salman al-Auda, who is a major religious figure, who spent a lot of time in Saudi jail, who's very anti-American, and is very hard to impugn as sort of a tool of the Saudi government or of anybody else. And so, and finally, in conclusion, that the strategic problems that Al-Qaeda has cannot be underestimated. Killing Muslim civilians, not having a positive plan about the future, just we know what they're against, but what are they really trying to create? Restoration of the caliphate, Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco is what bin Laden means by that. They've made a world of enemies. There's not a category of person or institution or government that isn't against them. And they won't make the kind of real-world political compromises to turn themselves into a political movement like Hezbollah or Hamas. So they are on the wrong side of history, as President Obama said at a recent West Point speech.
Peter, thank you so much. I can't think of a more insightful group of commentary, especially I think to end it on this note of looking at the big picture of Al-Qaeda and how it still fits into the Afghanistan and Pakistan picture at this point, and 9 years after September 11th. In the interest of time and knowing that you all have brought lots of good questions to the table, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into that period right now. Andrew here has a microphone, and we'll get him to go. We'll start right here in the front row.
Yeah, my question's for Michael Waltz.
And can you identify?
Yeah, I will. I'm Bob Dreyfus. I write for Rolling Stone magazine, which played a laudable role, I think, in explaining General McChrystal and his group's views on things like the wusses in the White House and Vice President Bite Me and so forth. The terms laughably absurd come to mind when I hear you say that President Obama is under-resourcing this war, since you apparently advised the administration that under-resourced it far more gravely for 8 years. But we'll skip over that. My question to you is about the opposition that you expressed to the deadline of July 2011, which, unlike the other panelists, I strongly support. You say that it's a mistake. I'd like you to tell me if that's the prevailing view among the military, which seems to have forgotten that the civilians run the war effort, not the generals. And if you could say a little bit about the prevailing view within the military command among people like Petraeus and McChrystal, whether they are willing to salute smartly and listen to what the commander-in-chief has to say, or whether they're going to resist this in various insubordinate ways.
Sure.
Just
Thanks,
a
Bob.
small little question to get
Sure,
us started
sure.
off.
Not a loaded one.
No, not at all. I will start by answering your first comment. I did advise both the previous administration, at the end of the administration, and currently, have the views I expressed today, which are my own views, that we were under-resourcing the effort, that the situation was declining precipitously. And you saw, I think, as a result of that, both an increase in resources, civilian and military, from President Bush at the end of 2008, and also from President Obama. That original 30,000 that General McKiernan had asked for was actually started in 2008. So certainly my advice was consistent. I think anyone who's worked in government knows that we're a very small cog in the wheel of kind of a chorus of advice that in the end the Commander-in-Chief is elected to make. I am going to decline to speak for General Petraeus or General McChrystal. I have it somewhat, as Susan alluded to, I think unique position in that I was at very extremes of the spear, so to speak. I mean, I was blessed and fortunate to work in the Pentagon, in the White House, and then I was very operational. I never was sitting in Bagram or sitting in Kabul in the headquarters. I actually made a point to avoid Bagram. I went there twice, and coming and going, because I viewed my role as being out amongst the populace and out amongst the Afghans. I can tell you, and shared with you today, some anecdotes of what a deadline, particularly in that part of the world, given our history or our perceived history of abandonment of the Afghan people and the Pakistani people, had in the immediate aftermath of that speech, and it undermined our efforts. It was difficult to overcome a notion where, in a situation where the Taliban, it's a little bit of a cliche, but they do consistently tell people the Americans will one day leave. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be next year, it may not be 10 years from now, but we will still be here. So be careful who you talk to and be careful whom you work with. And so to have on that, I think, a very well-intentioned deadline that, as Mr. Nawaz alluded to, that no one really paid attention to the footnotes was problematic.
Can I say something about the deadline? Yeah, I work at CNN as one of my job titles, descriptions, and the crawl. The text of the speech was released early, and so the crawl on CNN at 3:00 before President Obama went to West Point is July 2011. We're pulling out. That was so people saw the crawl, but not the. And then when President Obama delivered the speech, it was very interesting. There's ways of delivering a speech. So when he said it was conditions-based, he didn't sort of say, it'll be conditions-based. It was almost sort of like a clause in a speech that no one really noticed. And I think that, this is my own hypothesis, but I think that by agreeing on this, July 2011, it was a way of papering over incredibly large differences that continue to exist and are going to re-emerge in December. Because July 2011, everybody felt like they had won. So for the military, it's a conditions-based. Now, at the time, only of the 34 provinces in Kabul, only one province was controlled by the Afghans, and that is Kabul. So anybody in the U.S. military knows, surely, that a conditions-based July 2011 drawdown is not going to be particularly large if it's really conditions-based. And yet, on the political side of the White House, there is now a date certain for a withdrawal. And so if you look at what Rahm Emanuel has said occasionally on the talk shows, or Joe Biden, they're talking about a real drawdown. And then if you look at what some of the military folks are saying, they're saying that even Gates very quickly came out and said conditions-based. And I think the military will want to play down the December review. I think they already are. And I think the political side of the White House will want to play it up. And but the point is that this dispute was not resolved. And this was a way of papering over this dispute, I think.
Okay, let's take another question. One more in the front, and then we'll...
Honored Borgrove, CSIS. My question is for Mike Waltz. You seem to assume that if Taliban were to come back, al-Qaeda would be back in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
When I was with Mullah Omar, with my Pakistani crew, 3 months before 9/11, he made quite clear that there were major differences between the two. He complained about Osama bin Laden talking too much, issuing too many fatwas. And this is a man who, after all, horrible though he is, lost his country because of al-Qaeda. So why would he want al-Qaeda back?
Sure, I completely agree. It's an assumption. And it's an assumption based on my experiences. But I also think it's an assumption For me, one that makes me very nervous to look at the state of Afghanistan now with relative to its history, a fairly functioning civilian government, an army that is improving every day, a police force that needs help but is getting there, and 120,000 coalition soldiers that cannot control the rural countryside, to assume that even if the Taliban came back or even controlled portions, that they could reject or control those territories, I think is a dangerous assumption as well. I just think we have to be very careful. The flip side of that assumption is that if we're assuming if the Taliban rejected al-Qaeda, that they could actually implement that rejection. So that's the caution.
And I agree with Arno completely. I mean, al-Qaeda and the Taliban had a pretty rocky relationship.
Sure.
However, it's now 9 years since 9/11. Mullah Omar's had a lot of opportunity to say, I reject al-Qaeda, 9/11 was a bad thing, bin Laden's a bad guy. He's never said anything along these lines, nor is any leader of the Taliban that I'm aware of. Secondly, the idea, I mean, we keep thinking of this Afghanistan as like a separate country from Pakistan. Of course, the border doesn't exist. And so al-Qaeda is embedded with the Taliban, where it's headquartered, in Pakistan. I mean, the idea that the Taliban's not going to invite al-Qaeda back if they're in power, well, wherever they are in power, they've got al-Qaeda embedded inside them. Where's al-Qaeda headquartered right now? With the Haqqani network. What is the most powerful group of, I mean, Mike was on the other side of the border fighting these guys. The Haqqani network is much more important from a military standpoint than the Quetta Shura in terms of actually what's happening on the ground in Pakistan or in Afghanistan.
Do you want to add anything, Shuja? Okay, we'll take another. Let me reach into the back a little bit here.
Thanks. Ken Delanian from the LA Times. Sort of a related question on the drones. If I wasn't clear on what you were saying, Peter, have the drones sort of destabilized al-Qaeda in Pakistan? And if they have they prevented them from launching attacks? And if they have, why wouldn't that be enough in Afghanistan in combination with the CT strategy, Michael?
I mean, on the drones are, one thing about the drones you have to understand is they're only in the tribal regions, so they don't affect anybody outside the tribal regions. And no of the 170 plus drone attacks, I mean, absolutely none of them have been outside the tribal regions. So yes, they're somewhat disrupted, but I don't think that they, the fact that Faisal Shahzad is getting training, a year and a half after the drone program has been substantially amped up suggests that they're only useful up to a point. They are not. And by the way, why are the drones useful at all? I mean, what makes them useful? And Mike can address this better than I. But I mean, they're not. It's not in a vacuum. It's because you have an intelligence apparatus. I mean, the host was one of the places where this was being coordinated. That's why they attacked it.
I have to be somewhat careful. I am here representing my own personal views, but they are informed by a number of things. I'll tell you that. Out on the ground, as various explosions happened, leaders were targeted. It affected. We saw the calculation that the Pashtuns were constantly making, and it's constantly looking at who is going to win this, who should we back, how long are we going, how long are they going to be here. And I'll tell you, in one particular area, drones aside, that we were having a very difficult time and even getting anyone to speak with us. After a series of kinetic attacks, we had literally a convoy of elders coming down and folks wanting to talk to us left and right because we had finally taken action. And we had gotten rid of this contagion that they viewed as the Haqqani network that were squatting on their lands, that were taking some of their pine nuts is a huge kind of agricultural moneymaker there, and they were taking the proceeds, they were taking their national solidarity funds. So I certainly want to loop around and reinforce the notion of kind of the ideological, I think, halo has been removed from a lot of these actors, and the populace was thankful and glad to see them gone, and I'll just leave it at that. And I think it has a direct positive effect. Some of these kinetic actions on the populace's view of what we're willing to do in support of them.
I just want to add to what Peter was saying, that there isn't a border. And there isn't a border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and between Fatah and the hinterland. And so there are elements of AQ that are obviously in Fatah, but I doubt personally, and again this is based purely on assumptions, that the central leadership of al-Qaeda is in North Waziristan. Because why would you want to be in an area where there's some 35,000 troops? You can have accidental contact with them, particularly when you're going to be moving around with drones overhead in such vast quantities. And if you look back on the capture of the really key figures, they've all been captured in Pakistani cities. So you really have to hide in plain sight. It's much better there. You have the resources, and you don't have to rely on electronic communication to reach people. People can come and go, and you'll be like 18 million other people in Karachi, or 7 million other people in Lahore, or whatever. So in my view, all of Pakistan and all of Afghanistan becomes a place to hide in.
Next up, the surge in Karachi. We're going to get one more in the very back there, and we might have time for just one more question after that.
Chris Tucker, various affiliations. A lot of the conversation has switched between geostrategy and kind of operational organizational
I
questions.
apologize.
I'm sorry?
I apologize. I've kind of hopped back and forth. But
No, and I think that's good. Jack Devine had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, ex-CIA head of the Afghan task force back a long time ago, basically saying, hey, military, get out. Let's just do this as a CIA show, pure covert action. Regardless of what you think about that, there's clearly a continuum of operational footprint that we could have, but we've kind of taken the big army approach of a lot of brigade combat teams with a heavy footprint, but as you kind of said, not necessarily outside the wire doing what we need. Could you kind of talk about any opinions you might have on other operational footprints we could have, maybe a combination of white and black soft with kind of the Jack Devine strategy mixed in? We seem heavily committed to this BCT strategy, and with the way they're allowed to operate, it doesn't necessarily seem to give us what we are seeking. But yet that's what Americans are opposed to, 150,000.
I guess that's. I'll take that. I won't spend too much time on kind of advocating a counterinsurgency strategy. A counterinsurgency strategy, by its nature, takes a heavy footprint, and that is we can't forget the Afghan army and the Afghan police in that footprint. And it's just it's a fundamental approach. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of kind of bodies on the ground to create order. It doesn't take very much to create disorder. So, for instance, to throw a bomb in a movie theater really takes one or two guys and one act. Now, to secure every movie theater, say in Washington, D.C., takes a heck of a large force. So I do think the counterinsurgency approach and the kind of the traditional senses we're talking about it is the correct approach. And I forget the second part of the question. Okay.
All right, we'll take one more question. This woman near the camera. Right there.
Thanks. I'm Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times of London. I've covered Afghanistan and Pakistan for more than 20 years. You've talked a lot about the military strategy, and I know the title of this talk was Battle for Afghanistan and Pakistan, but I wondered whether you really thought you could achieve any kind of success as long as there is no credible government in Afghanistan. And we've seen a lot over the last few weeks about all the corruption and what's happening within the Karzai government. Thank you.
Okay. You know, ABC has done yearly polls since 2005, and they're either right or they're wrong, but I think they're likely to be right. Interestingly, they also poll in Pakistan, which they routinely find to be one of the most anti-American countries in the world. And it's very interesting what Afghans actually care about as opposed to the projection of what they care about that we impose on them. One of the things they don't really care about very much is corruption. What they really care about is what everybody in the world cares about, which is security and jobs. The reason the Taliban came to power, as Christina knows better than anybody in the room, is the Taliban provided security. at an enormous cost, imposing a theocratic regime that destroyed the economy. Doctors were earning $6 a month. But they did provide security. So, this is a very old lesson. Thomas Hobbes in the English Civil War basically pointed this out. And we haven't delivered that. And, just to connect with what Mike says, there's a pretty good reason we haven't done that. Afghanistan is larger than Iraq with a larger population. The Afghan army is still pretty feckless. It's interesting. The Afghans are the world's greatest fighters, and we seem to have created one of the world's worst armies. So I'm not quite sure how that happened, but in Iraq, there's a pretty effective army now, and it's the size of the Iraqi security services, army and police 2 years ago was 4 times larger than their Afghan counterparts. And so, I think that we've got ourselves our knickers in a twist about the corruption issue. Look at the neighborhood where this is, by the way. Mr. Zardari was Mr. 10% after all. I mean, corruption in this part of the world is rather naive to think that people aren't going to be filling their pockets. We have to choose our battles, and we've lost the focus on security as being the principal good that we should be delivering, and we haven't delivered it. And that's what Afghans want. And so if you go to the polling data, you can see very clearly that security and jobs are up here and corruption is here. The drug trade is sort of like at 2% and also worrying about foreigners is very low. And just to connect one final thing to Mike, what Mike said, the same BBC-ABC poll found that 63% of Afghans have a favorable view, not of the United States, but of the U.S. military. Can you think of any Muslim country in the world which has a 63% favorable view of anything to do with the United States, let alone the U.S. military?
I just to add quickly, there's an old saying that, at least over in Khost and Paktia, that the corruption that the Afghan hates the most is the one that's not benefiting them. And I had several elders that we were working with, and my interpreters tell me that time and time again. I'll tell you, I focused on security for a very pointed reason. We can look at 1,000 metrics. One of the metrics that really struck me in working in Host this time was that none of the district governors, we worked very hard to get them elected and get them nominated and working and resourced. None of the district governors in the 14 districts of Coast would actually live in their district. And most of them would not even go there to work. Minus one in Coast City. So to me, that's again another indictment that we have to provide the security. And when I say, and I think when Peter says security, that's both from the insurgency and from predatory elements of, particularly of the police. So that the average Afghan wants to be able to drive down the street in a relatively secure environment. It's what led to the rise of the Taliban with the various warlords, and it's what's leading to a lot of disenfranchisement today. So I pointedly focused on that element because I think that element sequentially needs to come first. Just as another point, the Supreme Court, just before I left, the Afghan Supreme Court ordered all of the provincial prosecutors to work only in the major cities of Khost and Gardez, and to not go out to the districts because it was too insecure. So I really only think we're going to get so far in terms of developing capacity and instituting governance until the security situation improves, which again, in my view, is going to take significantly more resources.
If I could just add to that, going back to 1970, when one of the few fair elections took place in Pakistan, and I was covering for Pakistan television in those days, and I went back to my village, and I was asking some of the tenants on our lands, who are they going to vote for? And they said they'd vote for the sword being the symbol of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And I said, why? And they said, because he's going to bring us running water. That was governance for them. Later, when he was overthrown, and I went back to the village, and I was asking people, which party are you going to support? And they still supported his party because they were still talking of food, clothing, and shelter for the people of the poorest people of Pakistan. And when I said to them, but he was corrupt, they said everyone is corrupt. So they take corruption as a kind of a given, but it's really governance that they're looking for. And most recently with the floods, it was quite apparent that the people that first reached them was the military. And then the U.S. Helicopters arrived. And that's what they saw, and that's what brought them what they needed. The provincial administrators, the central government figures all didn't show up. And of course, famously, the president of Pakistan was in Europe and didn't come back for at least a week after the floods had reached their height. So people really crave for governance and an ability to lead their lives with some element of security. Without that, all the rest become irrelevant.
That's a great note to end it on. Thank you so much for coming today, and thanks to the panelists.